groups. So the objective of this is to learn the difference between classful IP addressing and CIDR. And we'll be talking about what CIDR really is and what variable length subnet masking is and how to subnet with CIDR. So it's predominantly going to be like a bit of a history lesson at first. Prior to classful addressing, the first 8 bits of an IP address define the network that a given host was a part of. And this would have had the effect of limiting the internet to really just 254 networks. So you could see the issue with that. Traditional IPv4 addressing divides address space into 5 groups, but only groups A, B, and C are used for network hosts. D is reserved for multicasting IPv6 addresses, and Class E is reserved for future use, which I really don't know how to elaborate on. Each of these networks contained essentially 16 million different IP addresses. And as the internet grew, the inefficiency of allocating IP addresses this way became a very obvious problem. After all, there are a lot more than just 254 organizations that need IP addresses, and a lot fewer networks that need 16.7 million IP addresses to themselves. So simply put, we needed a way to more efficiently allocate addresses. And in 1981, RFC v9 or 791 and classful addressing came along to help solve that problem. With classful addresses, we went from just 254 available networks to 2,113,664 networks. The problem with classful IP addressing, however, is the limitation of the classes that you're given. Class A supports almost 17 million addresses, whereas B jumps down to almost 65,000, and Class C only has 254 hosts. So you're limited, you're very limited to these choices. And as you can see from these choices, there is quite a range in between the options. So as internet popularity continued to surge past 1981, it became clear that allocating blocks of 16 million, 65,000, or 254 addresses simply was not sustainable. Addresses were being wasted in too large blocks, and it was clear that there'd be a tipping point where we ran out of IP address space altogether. So let's take the scenario where you have a company and your company needs 2,000 IP addresses because it only has 2,000 computers. You have a few options. Well, you really only have 3 options, and these options aren't so great. Class A is clearly far too many hosts. B is also too many hosts. You'll be reserving 65,000 hosts when you only need 2,000, which needlessly ties up 63,000 hosts. So what if you have 8 Class C networks? This brings you close to the goal that you need, which would be 2,132 hosts, but this raises a second problem, the issue of having a very cluttered routing table entries. Basically, from the internet's perspective, you have 8 different networks. So classless addressing is an IPv4 addressing architecture that uses variable length subnet masking. And it basically decouples IP ranges from the default subnet mask. This allows for variable length subnet masking, which avoids the issue of classful addressing having fixed network sizes where each address has a default subnet mask. Using classless addressing and VLSM, addresses can be allocated much more efficiently. This is because network admins get to pick their network masks, and in turn, blocks of IP addresses that are the right size for any purpose. So breaking down the IP address. IP addresses are basically 32 bits in size, divided into 4 parts. Each part consisting of 8 bits. 8 bits integers ranging from 0 to 255. and IPs are denoted as sections or octets of 8 bits. So a decimal range of 0.0.0.0 to 255.255.255 is representative of these 8 bits. At a high level, CIDR works by allocating IP addresses to be assigned arbitrary network masks without respect to traditional classes. It utilizes a prefix notation to define the network and the host portions of an IP address. For example, in /24 CIDR range, we have the network portion taking up the first 3 octets and the host portion taking up that final octet. Decimal to binary conversion, you could think of it as just converting the decimal 255 to binary yielding 8 ones. So if we take that /24 CIDR range again, in binary, it could be represented as 3 octets of 8 ones and 1 octet of 8 zeros. And so we see in this table here, you have your traditional classes, how they would look in decimal and what their slash notation is in CIDR. The subnet mask can be shown as dotted decimal, as with between 255 and 3 different octets, or with a slash notation of /24. /8 simply means that there are 8 ones in the subnet mask. By using 255, you are selecting the octet or octets used to identify the network address. Let's see, did I, for example, okay, this is just another example. Okay, so inside our notation, if we were to take this IP address, it basically represents a network range of 192.168.0.1 to 192.168.0.254, because the first section is the network section and the final octet is the host section. Any questions so far? Cool. Really, the additional advantages of CIDR allows for not just the efficient use of IP addresses by dividing them into smaller groups, but also easier to manage and allocate these IP addresses. We also reduce the size of routing tables, which makes routing more efficient and faster. Let's see. So that's pretty much it for CIDR ranges. So now let's go cover subnetting in a little more detail. All right, I'm gonna switch to this screen. Let's I think what I'm gonna have you all do actually is maybe we'll gloss over this really quick, and then I'll let you all read it on your own, just because it could be very dry to try and go through this right now, and then jump back into your projects. Actually, let me ask again, how far along in assignment 3 are you all? Is anybody like pretty much finished with the entire thing?
I'm done.
Completely done? Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think I'm done.
Okay. Would either of you like to walk through what you have for the recording?
Sure.
Awesome. Let's gloss over subnetting, and then Edwin, you volunteered to walk us through your assignment. So like I was saying before, subnetting is basically the process of dividing a network into smaller subnetworks or subnets. And it is typically used to improve the organization and management of a network. Let's get rid of that, actually. And let's see. This talks about subnet masking. For example, if you have a network with a network ID of 192.168.0 and a subnet mask of 255.255.255, you could create a subnet with a network ID of 192. Okay, this was like that last slide that I showed you. What else? Yeah, this is really just covering everything in the slides in more detail. We talk about public subnets, private subnets, which you've already had experience and exposure to in your assignments. Talk about subnet classes. Okay, that was at the start of the slide deck. Yeah, this is all really just giving you a deeper dive into what we went over with the slide deck. So let's actually just switch over then to the assignment. I believe that was the WordPress assignment. And yeah, why don't you walk us through what you have? Let's have you share your screen, Edwin.
Are you guys able to see this page?
Yep.
Okay, so basically, we first ended up creating a VPC. We did a, how you call it, auto-generate everything within the VPC, so auto-generated our public and private. We also added a selected one NAT gateway.
Mm-hmm.
Once auto-generated, we went to our EC2 dashboard. We created two instances. One is going to be for your, we're going to be holding your WordPress, which is this one right here. In WordPress, then later once you, let me see. Obviously, you enter the name, you choose Amazon Linux 2, not 23, but second one. This is where the most important part is. So in your network settings, you go to edit, you choose the VPC that you ended up creating and generating,
Mm-hmm.
and you make sure it's actually testware VPC. Make sure this is disabled because later on you're gonna assign it and associate it with Elastic IP.
Sure. Let me ask you real quick. So you've chosen your VPC, but you also had selected the subnet. The subnet that you chose, had you already set up a route for it?
It automatically sets out a route because when we created our VPC, we didn't manually do it. We did a whereas auto generates all the routes for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was this intended to be the public or the private?
Oh, this is public. I switched it to the public subnet.
Okay, cool.
Then once you're gonna end up creating a security group. Obviously, you put a name that associates with your project. Inside here, you make sure that since it's public, put it for anywhere. Also add another security group for your HTTP. Do that also for anywhere. Then you launch instance. Once that starts up, you go back to EC2, wait for it to finish running, and it shows that it actually passed. Then you go back to your Elastic IPs. Then you allocate an Elastic IP and later you choose a EC2 instance that you want to associate it with.
Mm-hmm.
Then you go back to your instance. You end up same thing. You're gonna launch. My bad, my computer's a little bit slow. I name mine private, like for private database. It's almost gonna be exactly the same thing, but when you go to your VPC, it goes down. Also, you got to make sure you select the key pair or you create a new one. That's going to be important later when you SSH from your public to your uh private. You're going to choose a VPC that was created. Then you're going to make sure you chose the right subnet, which is going to be private. When you create your security group, same thing. Put a name that associates it with it. Right here is important. This is what I do. So I'd go to custom. Later, I make sure it's connected to my public subnet security group that we created from the other instance. So when you try SSHing from the public, it allows it already has that, it allows the inbound traffic to basically access the private. Then that's basically all I did on this one. Launch instance, make sure it runs all good, everyone's all good. You could go back to EC2. Am I going too fast?
No, I think you're going fine. Anybody thinks he's going too fast?
Didn't you have to add the MySQL port for the inbound?
I was going to do that later. But yeah, you could also do that. So go to your private security group, edit inbound rules, select this type, custom, and for testing purposes, I put it for all just to make sure it worked. But usually what you want to do is make sure you have it set to, I'm pretty sure it's going to be the public security group that you made earlier, if I'm correct. Or would it be Matt? Was it the public security group or is it the IP address of the public EC2 instance, IPv4?
Sorry, repeat the question for me.
When you do the type MySQL Aurora for that protocol, when you put custom, do we put the IPv4 address of the EC2 instance for the public?
I believe Chandra talked about that. The alternative would be to use the security group, but when Chandra did it, he used the IPv4.
Okay, so there's 3 ways then. Well, for my testing purposes, I put it for anywhere.
Okay.
So once you have that, so basically what you did is you configured your security group so it allows your public and private to pass traffic and have a connection, basically.
Nice.
So now you, oh, what happened? Then you go to connect, you open up your terminal. Let me slide my terminal over here. You're gonna SSH it. You're gonna do copy that right here. Once you go inside your public, you're gonna automatically go to your private instance. Before you do that, you gotta make sure that you're gonna touch a new pen file and you're gonna name the pen file exactly the key pair that you use for that private. Once you do that, open up your notepad and you copy and paste your whatever was inside that pen file to the new file created on EC2 instance. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
LS, make sure it's there. Once you make sure it's there, it's gonna allow you to basically go into your private EC2 instance, which is for security purposes, so not everybody has access to your database. Then later from here, since you're going up to a new instance, one of the commands you want to do is, where is it at? It's right here. You're gonna update everything. Once everything is updated, you're gonna do sudo system start MariaDB. That's wrong. First, you're gonna install it, which I don't have the command on me right now, but let me see if I could find it. Unless, do I need to show the command or am I good just to talk about what I did?
I think you're good.
Okay, so once you have everything installed, obviously you're gonna MySQL. Okay. And here, once you're inside your MariaDB database, you're gonna create a user. You're gonna create a user WordPress. You're gonna give it specific IP, which is when Chandra went through this, he did a specific way. It was kind of confusing for us. I'm gonna show it right here. Give me a moment. Basically, this is what we put in here. We ended up creating a user. We created the user WordPress, then the public IPv4. Because earlier, once we completed this and we tried to access it to our public EC2, it didn't allow us, so we had to go back to the private, create a new user, and have it. And once we created the new user, we needed to use this IPv4. Where is it? This IPv4 and grant it permissions.
Okay.
So wouldn't it be better for us to just, when we do create that user WordPress, to instead of use the public IPv4 of the EC2 instance, to use this right here, rather than having us to go back into our private, create a new user, add this IP to it, and grant it all the permissions from WordPress.
Yeah, I think he just went back because he did it wrong the first time. It was just fixing the mistake. I don't think he was doing it as like a two-step process.
Okay, so we should have been using this IP right here in the beginning.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. So once you do everything correctly and create your database plus your user, you're going to exit out of your private, go back to your public, and you're gonna install your Apache 2 and also your WordPress. Then once you pull everything for WordPress, you have to go to, where is it at? CD. You're gonna want to go to your wp-config .php and make sure that all the placeholders that were in here, that you put it with the right information, and your DB host is going to be your private IPv4 of your private instance. Then once everything is done there and everything is put in correctly where they're supposed to, you're going to want to test connection, and the way you test a connection is MySQL user. So it's going to be the user that we ended up creating in the private. So for mine, it's going to be this. The host is going to be the private IPv4. Now you're able to access your database from your public and from your private, from your public to your private. And to show that it works, where is it at?
Oh, so you don't have to do the other WordPress config that's in that WordPress directory, just the...
I don't think so, because the only thing that's when you run the HTTP HTTPD, like when you restart it, is running in the directory of HTML. It's not running on the directory of WordPress, if I'm correct. Julius, is that correct? Or
I think so, yes.
right here. Hopefully it still works. Then WordPress. I know my explaining is not very good, but
I think
it works.
yeah, it definitely works. I think this is awesome. I think you did a great job explaining it, actually, Edwin. So awesome work.
Thank you.
So, wow, I guess if you haven't finished the assignment yet, just continue working on it. I think this recording is good for, I think, the two students who aren't here right now, so that they'll have something to reference in case they get stuck anywhere. I really don't know what else I could give you guys today. Chandra, when he messaged me this morning to cover for Preston, he linked me to, yeah, really just the CIDR and subnetting readmes and going through the VPC. It looks like this is the only other assignment that you have. And he even has a part 2 scheduled for Monday. So I might have to let him know that you all are moving through this pretty quick and to just move on to the next section.
Yeah, so I mean, we started touching on this Thursday. So I'm having, the reason why I didn't raise my hand, I'm having a network connection issue, but I've rebuilt this thing like 3 times at this point. And so for me, I'm good if we land the plane here. I'm going to resolve my network issue, but I don't need new content. I would be curious from your professional experience, how does subnetting work into DevOps specifically? Is it just background information, or do you actually have some sort of applied aspect?
It really depends on what team. Well, not even what team you're on. I guess to an extent it depends on what team you are on. Like, let's say you have like a platform engineering team that takes care of all of this for you. In that case, you're going to want to have a very extensive knowledge on this, because not only are you going to want to set up the pipeline for this, but you're also going to want to be able to walk other engineers through the entire process. Other engineers from different teams, if there is an infrastructure in place to a pipeline, basically to have all of this set up, in our case, we use Terraform for everything. You'll only need a very basic understanding of CIDR ranges and subnetting to create the proper configuration files for your Terraform for whatever you're trying to provision or instantiate.
Okay, thank you.
Got a request if it's possible, Julius. So for me, when it comes to creating like architecture diagram of what we do, is a little bit confusing. Is it possible for you to, like, for this assignment, to show us how it will look like as a diagram so we could use it as a reference? Because the way I look at it is, I know you have a public EC2 and a private EC2. How would that go in the flow in the diagram with all these 2 different components?
Well, let's start with the diagram that you already have. I think you've created one, right? Let me.
Yes, that was for one of the old assignments that we had.
How detailed are you asking, Edwin? Are you asking for like NAT and gateways and that, or you're just asking what space everything's in?
Basically how it will look like. I don't really know how detailed, but basically how the flow will go.
I think what makes this question kind of hard to ask is, or answer is, it's diagramming. So you could go about it like really so many ways. I think it's easy to get lost in diagramming, which is why it's nice to follow certain standards sometimes. And I think one of the best standards for diagramming is the C4 standard. So let me look this up real quick. Basically, C4 divides everything into a hierarchy of like 4 different tiers. I forget who came up
So is
with
that
it.
like industry, like industry baseline?
I don't know if it's an industry baseline. I would say it's definitely one of the more prominently known standards there is out there, but I don't think there is really an industry baseline when it comes to diagramming. Let me share this real quick. So the C4 model for visualizing software architecture, it basically divides everything into 4 categories. You have like your very outer system context diagram. Well, I guess this website goes through this introduction and this explanation about how if you don't have standards for diagramming, this is what you end up with, basically just a Wild West style kind of map where like anything goes. The idea behind the C4 model is that we avoid this mess by creating layers, the outermost layer being like the system context diagram. So like, let's say a very large overview of what you want your application to be. In this example, we have an internet banking system that sends emails using an email system, which is what sends the email to the personal banking customer. And you can see it's a very clean, simple flow here. Now, of course, this is very high level. It's not going to explain the nuances of the architecture. So this is where you go down 1 layer deeper. Now, within each higher component, you have containers to separate the different groups of functions in your application. So here you're seeing it's becoming more and more granular and modular. And it breaks down even further to the components of each container. And from here, you can go deeper into the code inside each of these components. So to answer your question, Edwin, what I'm visualizing with how you have your public and private subnets, I would imagine those being the container levels of the diagram. So at a high level, you have basically your layout of the AWS infrastructure. You go down a layer deeper to show the more granular aspects of that architecture. And from there, you could show the more nuanced configurations in the 3rd layer. Does that make sense?
And if you're just asking based off the diagrams that we have made, how what we're designing today looks, I can speak to that briefly, and then Julius can like tell me I'm wrong or qualify it better, if that would help, Edwin.
Sure.
Give me a second. Let me screen share real quick. There we go. Shout out to Steven for teaching me how to make flowy arrows.
Nice.
So the ingress, you essentially have our setup. Somewhere out here is your local box, right? So that's your Windows system or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It comes in through your AWS system and routes to a public subnet. In this case, we're doing it through SSH, right? So your box reaches out and it touches into an EC2 server. So the EC2 server is just basically the hardware of the car. And then we add to it the stack of the Apache and on that serves the WordPress contents. So this would be our public subnet. I'm sorry, I didn't have time to design a new one. And then our private subnet. You wouldn't necessarily need natural address translation because the public subnet doesn't need this. And then the private subnet is not touching the outside, so it doesn't need to be translated. So in the public space, we would have a subnet here that is your Apache server with your WordPress on it. You then spin up a secondary EC2 server over in your private subnet space, and that's your second Linux 2 box. And then you add on top of that the stack of the MariaDB, which is a MySQL subset. Then you go into your configuration file here. Well, first you go into your setup for your MariaDB, and you spin up your user account information, right? You then take that information, you go back to your WordPress server, you configure your WordPress server to point to this database because this won't be accessible. So what we're doing is we're home, we SSH in, and then we jump over to the server from public space to private space. So that's one SSH connection and then two SSH connections. It's called tunneling. Then after that's configured, what ends up happening is you close off your SSH connections. This should have a port 80 access, which allows HTTP access. So the Apache server that serves the WordPress files is now accessible through web browser. So anyone who has your IP address or domain, if it's linked, when they contact that, so let's say we did use Route 53, our domain's cached there, and it says, oh, this domain goes to this IP. Once it does that, you just viewing this doesn't intrinsically use the database. It pulls from the database, but from what I've read, the WordPress database essentially the WordPress platform uses the database for like comments and users and all this other stuff. So let's say you create a user, it doesn't live here. It then creates an entry within your database, and then as you comment and interact and whatever, it should be filling tables within this database. And then when someone logs in to look at it, it's being served up this content through the lens of the WordPress server. So hopefully that's a decent explanation. If you have questions, I can try to answer it. Did I miss anything, Julius?
No, that was a very solid explanation. Awesome work. While you were demonstrating or talking through how these two communicate, this is an example of where if you wanted to go one layer deeper in a diagram, you'd have a different section to show the nuance of the communication between your first EC2 instance and your other one. But that explanation was pretty perfect. So solid work, everyone.
Yeah, I kind of fit the pieces together because I was just wondering, like, because I know how to do it through the GUI and through the terminal. My mind was like wrapping, like, how do they talk? Like, well, what's the flow of it? But it opened up a lot. So thank you, Matt, and thank you, Julius.
Yeah, talking through the diagram really like makes it seem more simple and easier to understand.
Yeah. Well, when you're hopping boxes, so it's pretty easy when you're on a Linux box, hopping to a Linux box, hopping to a Linux box. But if you start touching different VMs that are different systems, your commands may or may not work. So like if I'm on a Linux box at home and I jump onto this EC2, which is Windows, and then my ls command won't work and I don't know why, and so on. And so knowing where you are currently helps understand what you're trying to point to and feedback from. Now, I don't understand how WordPress, if it updates in real time or when a user logs in, to the website once they push the get request, does that then refresh the database? I haven't gotten that far in the technical side.
Yeah, Chandra might be able to answer that question better. I haven't actually gone through all of this myself yet.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, I think we're building out a frame. I don't think we're making a fully functional WordPress with content and whatnot.
Right. Awesome. Let's see. Does anyone have any other questions about what we covered today or what's going to happen next?
You want to tell us what we need to expect on this test that's coming up in like a week or two?
All right, let's see. Which test is this?
It should be our first one.
Yeah, so are these like take-home things that we have multiple days for, or is it like doing it during class time?
Yeah,
You stare at us.
In the other curriculum, all the assessments are take home and you have like multiple days to work on them. I don't see why it would be too different here. But no, because I have less visibility, because Chandra's teaching the majority of this class, it's hard to say. Like this is really, I think, the second or third time we've done the DevOps curriculum, and it's primarily been Chandra's show. So let's see. Nick, do you happen to know anything about the upcoming assessment?
I do not.
I'll reach out to Chandra. I'll see if I could get any info out of him.
I personally thought that you guys going to take us one by one, then just Zoom call, share screen, like do it.
Yeah, right. And also the test is a black box, so you don't even get the benefit of knowing what's on it. No pressure.
Of course, no pressure. Yeah, I'll reach out to him. I'll see what I can find out. I think we could cut the recording here.